that to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. So performance measurement we define as the ongoing and systematic process of tracking outputs and outcomes for your program. And by outputs, we mean amount of service provided, but what exactly that means will depend on your program design. For a lot of AmeriCorps state and national grantees, outputs tend to be number of people served by the program, but for other programs, it could be things such as acres of land treated by AmeriCorps members or number of organizations served. Outcomes are changes or benefits that occur in your program as a logical consequence to the intervention or the activities that are taking place. And again, for many ASN grantees, these are changes that are directly related to people, but they could also be changes in organizations, in the broader community, or in the environment. Generally speaking, we classify outcomes as changes in knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition. KABC is your acronym for that. As I mentioned, these outcomes should be logically connected to your program's intervention and should also be aligned with your outputs. So if your output, for example, counts the number of people served by the program, then the outcome should reflect a change in those same people's knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition in life. So what's the point of performance measurement? Three main purposes for performance measures. The first is to be able to recognize whether or not progress is being made. You, as the program lead, know what it is that you ultimately want your project to accomplish. Performance measurement can tell you whether you are reaching your goals, and if so, at what pace. It can also tell you whether you're implementing your project in the way that you had planned. The second purpose is to provide accountability. Obviously, we here at CNCS require that you report your progress to us via performance measures, but you also may have other funders and stakeholders that also request this kind of information from you. Performance measurement is an objective way and a meaningful strategy for communicating achievements to your stakeholders in a way that makes sense to them. And then the third purpose, is program improvement. Performance measurement gives you benchmarks that tell you whether or not you're meeting your goals, and if you're not meeting those goals, might also give you insights to help you figure out where you could strengthen your interventions to reach your goals more effectively. Performance measurement can also help you figure out how to allocate personnel resources and funding in the most optimal way, especially in an environment where resources are limited, which I know is familiar to many of you on the webinar today. From CNCS's perspective, performance measure data helps us tell a story of collective impact of AmeriCorps members and other national service programs across the country. One of the main ways that we do that is through our set of national performance measures. These give us also the chance to speak the same language about outputs and outcomes that many programs have in common. There are a set of national performance measures for all 6 CNCS focus areas. That's education, healthy futures, economic opportunity, veterans and military families, disaster services, and environmental stewardship. And there are also a set of national performance measures for capacity building activities. Now, CNCS expects grantees to select national performance measures if their program design is consistent with these measures. That being said, we do recognize that there are some AmeriCorps projects and program models for which the national performance measures might not quite fit. So as a result, grantees also have the option to create what we call applicant-determined measures, either as output-outcome aligned pairs or as outcomes for existing national performance measure outputs. On this slide, you see the baseline performance measure requirements for AmeriCorps state and national applicants. For folks on the webinar today who have applied for AmeriCorps grants in the past, you will notice that nothing has changed here. These requirements are the same as they were last year and have been consistent now for a number of years. AmeriCorps applicants are required to have at least one aligned performance measure, aligned meaning output paired with outcome, that is connected to the program's primary intervention or primary service activity. Now, it's up to the applicant, to define your primary intervention. There's no set minimum member service years or number of AmeriCorps members that have to be associated with it. Instead, you should decide what is primary based on your theory of change as it's described in your application narrative and your logic model. However, the intervention, whichever intervention you define as primary, needs to be a community-focused intervention, not a member-focused intervention. Member-focused performance measures are no longer permitted. More about that shortly. You can list member-focused interventions as secondary interventions. The required aligned performance measure can either be a national performance measure or an applicant-determined performance measure. You are not required to use national performance measures, and applicants don't get extra credit for using national performance measures. That being said, again, we do expect applicants to use national performance measures if they are a good fit for the program's theory of change. I think I've used that term once before, so if you're not familiar with the term theory of change, it means the chain of logic between the community need, the program activities, and the expected outputs and outcomes of those activities. So again, if national performance measures are a good fit for the theory of change, we expect applicants to use them. It is not allowable to create applicant-determined measures that duplicate national performance measures. Applicants are welcome to have more than just the minimum. You can have more than just the single required performance measure if you choose to do so. But as you should see on this slide on the second bullet, we only want applicants to propose outputs and outcomes that capture significant program activities. Now, there's no set definition of significance, again, so applicants can use their own judgment about what counts as significant in their context. But generally speaking, the quality of performance measures is more important than the quantity. Just like there's no extra credit for using national performance measures, there's also no extra credit for having lots and lots of measures. AmeriCorps applicants are not required to capture all of their program activity in performance measures. The performance measure instructions document is a fundamental guidance document. We talk about the notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO. We talk about the application instructions. Performance measure instructions are fundamental just like those. And so you should refer to the performance measure instructions whenever you are creating or editing performance measures for your application. The performance measure instructions document provides an overview of the performance measurement requirements for all AmeriCorps program grants. That means grants that enroll AmeriCorps members. I should mention that AmeriCorps planning grants, as well as support grants that are made to commissions, have different performance measurement requirements. So right now we're talking about grants that enroll AmeriCorps members. The performance measure instructions also lay out the selection rules for national performance measures. So in other words, which national performance measure outputs can be paired with which outcomes, and which objectives and service activities, which is another word for interventions, are linked to each measure. There are also detailed instructions in the document about how to use each individual output and outcome measure. There are 3 appendices at the end of the document. You can use those as resources when developing performance measures, including both national performance measures and applicant-determined performance measures. Appendix A has a tutorial about how to assign MSYs, or member service years, and member positions to objectives and performance measures within the application. Appendix B has a checklist that you can use to self-assess your performance measures and fix common problems before submitting your application to CNCS. It is not a fully 100% comprehensive checklist. It's not going to catch every potential problem or issue you might find in a performance measure, but it will help you to be responsive to the AmeriCorps state and national performance measure requirements. And then Appendix C has a set of frequently asked questions and answers about performance measures, including an FAQ that summarizes some of the recent changes made to performance measures, specifically in 2019. To find those performance measure instructions, you can follow the link you see on this slide directly. You can also go to, or sorry, the link on the slide is to the main NOFO page, the main Notice of Funding Opportunity page. If you go to that page, you will find a link to performance measure instructions, and you can click on that. I have a direct link just to the performance measures document at the end of this slide deck, so stay tuned for that. I mentioned briefly in the last slide that we had made some significant performance measure changes in 2019. If you or one of your subgrantees applied for competitive funding in 2019, you might remember that those changes to the National Performance Measure Matrix were quite significant in that year. This slide provides a quick summary of what the main changes were. And also, as a reminder to folks who were part of this process, all 2019 applicants, and that included continuation applicants, were required to revise their measures last year to follow those updated performance measure instructions. In an ideal world, that would have all been done last year. Unfortunately, not all applicants completely followed through on making the necessary changes. So if you or one of your subgrantees applied for recompete or continuation funding last year, and you did not yet revise your measures to follow the updated performance measure instructions, you will need to do that this year in your continuation and or recompete application. And I should note that this applies to both competitive and formula applicants. So for the commission staff on the phone, please make sure that your formula programs are making these changes as well. One of the changes made in 2019 is that AmeriCorps state and national performance measures must focus on community impact, not the impact of the program on AmeriCorps members themselves. This is not because CNCS does not value member outputs and outcomes. In fact, it's actually just the opposite. CNCS expects all AmeriCorps programs to create meaningful member experiences and to provide valuable training and support to members that will lead to positive member outcomes during service and also after service. For that reason, CNCS wants all grantees to be able to report on member outputs and outcomes, not just grantees that opt into specific performance measures. So starting in the current program year, the 2019 program year, there is a set of optional performance data elements that is formerly known as demographic indicators. You may recognize, if you've done progress reports before, that these have always been a feature on AmeriCorps progress reports. This new set of performance data elements will be available to all grantees on their progress reports to report member-focused outputs and outcomes. And also, as a reminder, we also have the member exit survey that collects data on member impacts as well. In 2020, we didn't make any major significant additional changes to the performance measure matrix, just a few additional small changes. You can see them on the slide here. The most significant change is making national performance measure outputs available under a few additional objectives under education, healthy futures, and economic opportunity focus areas. Now, as was the case in 2019, all 2020 applicants, including continuations, and including both competitive and formula, are required to revise their performance measures as they need to align with the 2020 performance measure instructions. So thank you in advance for all the work that you have done and will be doing at the state and national level to make this happen. Let's transition to some best practices in designing performance measures. This list was developed several years ago by a team of CNCS staff based on the hundreds, literally, of performance measures that we review each year. So let's start with selecting performance measures that fit your program design and theory of change, not vice versa. In other words, please start with your own vision for what your program will do and what you hope to accomplish. And don't create your performance measures until after you have fully developed your theory of change and logic model for your program. Do not try to artificially fit your program model into a particular performance measure just because you want to use that measure. A performance measure is not going to be helpful for your program if it doesn't effectively capture what you actually intend to do. Read the instructions is the second bullet. I mentioned before that the performance measure instructions document is a fundamental guidance document for preparing an application. So before you choose a national performance measure or any performance measure, it's important that you read the instructions for that measure very closely and that you follow all the requirements specified in the performance measure instructions. The next pointer is that less equals more. Remember that you are only required to select one performance measure, output plus outcome, connected to your primary intervention. You are welcome to select additional performance measures if you want to, including output-only measures if you so choose, if they make sense for your program design. But if an activity will not be significant in terms of time and effort on the part of AmeriCorps members, we encourage you not to create a performance measure for it. You can and should collect and monitor data on those activities for your own programmatic purposes, program improvement purposes, and so forth, but you do not need to report the data to CNCS as a performance measure. Next bullet, clearly define the terms you use and ensure that they are meaningful. It's really helpful to specify what you mean by key words and phrases that you include in your performance measures text, such as the word improvement. The word improvement could mean a very large change, it could mean a very small change. We don't know that unless the term is defined. Or a term like increased knowledge, for example, might mean a tiny change or a large one, again, very dependent on program context. So defining that is really helpful. And it's also helpful to explain why that level of change you've defined is meaningful to program beneficiaries. That will help you use performance measures to tell your story effectively. Just to repeat what I said before, it bears some repeating. Please use national measures when they fit your program design. In fact, you're required to use national performance measures in any case where your program design and measurement strategy is the right fit for those measures. Please do not create applicant-determined measures that duplicate or are very similar to existing national measures. And we also don't want you to type national measure codes and definitions into an applicant-determined measure field in the performance measure module. We see that every year. So please don't do that. If you can't find a national measure in the module, it probably means you didn't select the right objective. So you actually need to back up a step in the performance measure module and choose the right objective. The first couple of pages in the performance measure instructions will show you which measures are located under which objectives. And then please use system-defined intervention categories whenever you can. The 2020 performance measure instructions list particular interventions or service activities for each performance measure. If one or more of those interventions matches the activities you will be doing, please select the system-defined interventions. Don't create your own. You should only create your own if none of the existing interventions that are there in the system is a good fit for your service activities. If you are a continuation applicant or a recompeting applicant, and you currently are using an intervention category that is no longer showing up in the performance measure instructions, it's been discontinued, please switch to using the new system-defined intervention if you can. Clearly distinguish outcomes from outputs while maintaining logical alignment. This is a mistake that's most commonly made with applicant-determined measures. You need to make sure that your outcome doesn't just count participation in a program or just restate the output measure, but actually reflects a real change in knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition. So for example, if the output is the number of individuals participating in a program, the outcome can't be the number of individuals who complete the program, because it's not a change in knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition for those individuals. Instead, it would be better to set the outcome as the number of individuals who gained knowledge of program content, or the number of individuals that take specific actions as a result of participating in the program. Choose outcome measures that are ambitious but realistic. We want you to shoot for the moon when you set your long-term goals for your program, and we'd like you to include those long-term goals in your logic model. However, you don't need to report on those long-term goals in your performance measures. Performance measures are not really a good fit for long-term goals. Instead, it's better to measure short or medium-term goals that are attainable in a single grant year, so you can report on them, but they reflect important steps toward those ultimate longer-term goals. For example, if your ultimate goal is for children to grow up to be healthy adults, you don't need to, and you can't, measure that in a single year. Instead, you could measure the number of children that have increased their level of physical activity as a result of participating in the member-led program. This is a meaningful change in behavior. It's appropriately ambitious, and it's a logical step toward developing healthier adults. But it's also measurable in a single year, and so you'll be able to report on it. For outcomes that require participant follow-up, think about how you set your targets. There are many outcomes that require post-surveys, tests, or some other type of participant follow-up to determine whether changes in knowledge, attitude, behavior, or condition actually happened. Unfortunately, as I think all of you on this webinar know, if you've ever tried this, it's rarely possible to get 100% of your participants to respond to surveys or follow-up requests. And we don't want you to do some fancy, quote-unquote, fancy math and extrapolate your results unless you have an approved sampling plan. So if you only get half of your beneficiaries to respond to your survey, please don't double the results and say it's 100% response rate. That does not work. Instead, what you should do is set your outcome targets somewhat lower than your output targets to account for the likely less than 100% response rates. Now, that being said, you should also make it a goal to achieve the highest response rates possible and set up your data collection strategies accordingly. For longer-term outcomes, set targets that are achievable in a single grant year. There are some performance measures that involve changes in condition, for example, high school graduation or obtaining a job, that may not be achieved by all beneficiaries in just one program year. For these types of performance measures, it's important to set targets that reflect what can be accomplished in that single year. So for example, if your program is designed to help students graduate successfully from high school, but your program serves students in grades 9 through 12, your target for the performance measure should only reflect the students who would be eligible to graduate from high school within the current grant year. That is likely to be only the 12th grade students in this example case. That does not mean you shouldn't serve 9th grade through 11th grade students. It just means that you'll need to set your outcome target as a smaller subset of the output target and then explain your rationale for doing that. Use numerical targets, not percentages. As I mentioned, we use performance measures here at CNCS to talk about collective impact. That means that we roll up, we add up numbers across multiple programs. We can't add percentages, so please use raw numbers instead. Use pre-post assessments when possible. Objective measures generally yield better data than subjective measures. So if I was to ask you at the end of this webinar whether you feel like you know more about performance measurement than you did at the beginning of the webinar, you may say yes just to be nice or just to make me feel better. But if I gave you a pre and post assessment that actually measured your knowledge about performance measurement before and after the webinar, it may or may not show the increase in knowledge that you and I both believed would have taken place. And that's because perceptions of change are often different than the actual change itself. Select select data collection instruments that are valid and reliable. The data you collect on performance measures is not going to be meaningful to you or to CNCS unless you can say with confidence that those numbers mean what they're supposed to mean and that the meaning does not fluctuate across different sites or across different time periods. To be able to make good decisions about a program, you need to have good data. And good data comes from high-quality data collection instruments. For example, consider selecting an instrument that has been tested by an independent third party and has been proven to measure the particular type of change you are interested in measuring. Or pilot test the instrument yourself and check the quality of the data you receive before you decide to start using that instrument for your whole program. Choose data collection instruments that are accessible and yield timely data. If you rely on an instrument for education programs who might be on the webinar today, some of you might have thought about the state standardized test as a potential instrument. If you rely on an instrument like that where there can be several months of delay in receiving the results, or where there might be a lot of restrictions or hurdles in accessing the data, you may have difficulty getting the performance measure data and or using it to make informed decisions about your program. So you might consider looking for alternative instruments where the data are more accessible and there's a quicker turnaround time for decision making. And finally, allocating sufficient resources. There's never quite enough resources to go around. We know this, but data collection is and should be a significant investment, both in terms of dollars and also in terms of staff time and AmeriCorps member time. And you'll want to build those dollar and time investments up front into your budget, into your staffing, and into your program design. Performance measurement will not be done effectively if it becomes an unexpected add-on to someone's already full schedule, or if your folks don't receive adequate training on how to do it. We are now transitioning into the second half of the webinar, in which we look at a particular example and play around with how we might design a measure for that example. I'm going to take a moment. I know there's one question that we received. Thank you for putting questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free, all the other folks on the webinar, to keep doing that. The question is, you mentioned that programs shouldn't adjust their program to meet CNCS system-defined performance measures, but that doesn't apply for capacity building programs since they can't create their own performance measures. Is that accurate? So you are correct that in the capacity building space, for the capacity building focus area, as it were, you cannot create applicant determined measures. That's because the capacity building output that we have is a gigantic bucket. Basically, it's the number of organizations that are being served. And that's what capacity building is. So there's really no kind of output that would meet the definition of capacity building that would be outside of that. So that's the reason why you can't create an applicant determined measure in capacity building, because there's no space outside of the existing national bucket. Thanks for the question. So again, any other questions that come in, feel free, that you think of rather, feel free to put them in that Q&A box, and we'll take a look at the Q&A box after we go through this example. Designing a measure. We're going to look at an example of how an AmeriCorps applicant would go about selecting and designing a performance measure. On the slide here, you see a brief summary of a hypothetical program called EduCorps. The EduCorps program is requesting 6 half-time AmeriCorps members to lead one-on-one and small group tutoring programs for middle school students at a high-poverty school. The primary goal of the program is to improve students' achievement levels in mathematics and to help students stay on track for high school graduation. Members will meet with groups of 1 to 3 students after school each day for about an hour each, using mathematics enrichment materials that complement the normal classroom curriculum. Members will also lead daily large group activities focused on physical activity and healthy eating. So with that as our context for this example, our first step is where all applicants should start, with the baseline performance measure requirement, an aligned measure, output plus outcome, connected to the primary service activity. I've mentioned this several times now, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it. CNCS expects the applicants to choose national performance measures if those measures are consistent with their program design. In the case of EduCorps, the primary service activity is academic tutoring, and that fits under the CNCS's K-12 Success Strategic Plan objective. On the slide, you see a snip of the performance measure instruction selection rules under that objective. And you'll see here that there are several possible national performance measure pairs related to this objective. Given that the main goal of this example program is improving students' achievement in mathematics, reading the titles of these measures suggests that outcome measure ED5A, which is number of students with improved academic performance, could be a good fit for the program design. Per the chart shown on this slide, the required output measure that pairs with ED5A is ED1A, which is number of individuals served. So the aligned performance measure the applicant should create will consist of output ED1A plus outcome ED5A. I also mentioned earlier that the applicants should select from the system-defined list of interventions when possible. You'll see the interventions in the right-hand column. Since tutoring is included in the predefined list, the program should select this intervention as their primary service activity connected to this aligned performance measure. So at this point, the applicant is done in terms of requirements. They're only required to have this one performance measure. However, the description of this program indicated that the members are also engaged in some other activities beyond tutoring, including physical fitness and nutrition programs. So the applicant has the option of selecting additional performance measures for these activities if they want to. These could be either aligned measures, output plus outcome, or they could be output-only measures. But I want to emphasize that this is not necessary. And in fact, the applicant should not add these other measures unless the activities that those measures would capture are considered significant. In other words, they are a substantial part of the applicant's theory of change and proposed member service activities. It's also important that any performance measure the applicant selects is measurable during the grant year. One other thing that the example program overview mentioned is that the AmeriCorps program also works on having students stay on track for high school graduation as one of their long-term goals. This is a program that serves middle school students. So staying on track for high school graduation is a great long-term goal, but it's not something that would be measurable within a one-year period and probably not even within the period of the three-year grant. So that is an outcome that would be better assessed through evaluation rather than performance measurement. Step 2, once the applicant has tentatively selected outputs and outcomes, it's important for them to read the performance measure instructions carefully for each national performance measure output and outcome they selected. The applicant needs to make sure that the measures truly are the right fit and that their program design will allow them to meet the requirements for each national measure in terms of eligibility, who or what can be counted under the measure, as well as data collection, appropriate instruments to collect data. One of the significant changes we made last year to the performance measure instructions is that the categories of who or what can be counted under particular measures have been broadened quite a bit. So some of you who've been around for a while may remember the discontinued measure ED1. We had that previous to 2019. In that one, individuals had to meet a particular definition of economically disadvantaged. Measure ED1A, which you see on the slide here, does not include that requirement, that definition. Programs are free to include under this measure any recipients of CNCS supported services related to education. Do keep in mind, though, that programs should only count individuals who actually receive the intervention associated with the performance measure. And in the case of AmeriCorps, that would mean they were counting the middle school students who received the tutoring intervention. For ED5A, the outcome measure, the performance measure instructions state that only students counted under the output, ED1A, can be counted under the outcome, ED5A. So the applicant can't report more students under the outcome than they do under the output. And that is true for almost all performance measures. There can't be more under the outcome than there are under the output. The instructions also provide guidance about appropriate instruments for collecting data under this measure. We will come back to that and talk more about that on a later slide. The important thing to keep in mind right now is that if an applicant's program design will not allow them to meet the requirements for a particular measure, they should not use that measure. They can either select a different national performance measure or create an applicant-determined measure that is a better fit. Step 3, define all terms clearly. You saw that the instructions for measure ED5A include a definition of improved academic performance, and that is shown here on the slide, an improved demonstration of skill or knowledge in one or more academic subjects. That's a pretty general definition. So it is up to the applicant to decide what this should look like in the context of their own program. An improved demonstration of skill or knowledge will look very different for a kindergartner versus for a middle school student. It will also look very different for a literacy-focused intervention versus for a math-focused intervention. Performance measures are about telling your story effectively. So it is to your advantage as an applicant and to AmeriCorps' advantage as a hypothetical applicant to spell out the details of what improvement will mean for your program and why that level of change will be meaningful to program beneficiaries. If it's not clear that what you're going to be measuring in a performance measure is actually significant, you may have CNCS ask you to revise or delete the measure during the clarification or resolution process. AmeriCorps has provided an example definition here at least 1.1 years of academic growth from the beginning to the end of the school year. That is not the only definition that can be used. That is just one of many possible definitions. But what's nice about this definition is that it's clear that the level of growth here exceeds the expected student growth rate for an academic year. So it's clear that this level of change will be meaningful. The next step is to figure out the member resources that the applicant will allocate to the performance measure. This is based on the number of members and the amount of each member's time that is going to be devoted to the intervention captured by the performance measure. Member time, the portion of member time, is expressed in MSYs, member service years. Individual members, in contrast, can participate in more than one type of service activity. So members themselves can be counted under more than one performance measure. But MSYs, as the amount of member time, cannot be double counted across different measures. I know that can be difficult to understand and to reconcile. There is an appendix in the performance measure instructions, Appendix A, that can help walk you through this as well. We will try to do a little bit of mental math here as part of this example, but do look at that appendix if you need more detail. It is important to remember that not all members and MSYs have to be captured under performance measures. They do all have to be assigned to program objectives, but not to performance measures. And there's no required minimum for the percentage of an applicant's MSYs or members that have to be allocated to performance measures. This will depend on how an applicant defines their primary service activity. In the case of AmeriCorps, it was clear from the program description that all members are doing the tutoring intervention. So all 6 members are contributing to the performance measure related to tutoring. Hence, you see 6 members in italics on the slide. But the description also said that in addition to tutoring, members lead activities related to fitness and nutrition. Those are in a totally different focus area. That's healthy futures. And they don't connect to this particular performance measure. So only a portion or fraction of members' time, we're going to say in this case the program estimates 2/3 of members' time, is spent on tutoring. So only 2/3 of the program's total MSYs, which again represents member time, should be allocated to this performance measure. The program has 6 half-time members. That's 3 MSYs overall. 2/3 of 3 is 2 MSYs devoted to this measure. Again, mental math, not so easy to do in a webinar context. Please go back to Appendix A if you need to learn more about MSY and member allocations and how to do those. The next step in performance measure development is to set output and outcome targets. These should reflect a realistic but ambitious estimate of what the members who are contributing to the performance measure are likely to be able to accomplish in a single program year. And the targets should also be logically related to each other. As I mentioned before, the target for the outcome should not exceed the output target in most cases. In our example program, AmeriCorps, the applicant estimates that 6 half-time members spending 2/3 of their time on tutoring can collectively tutor 90 students per year. So we're setting that target for ED 1A, the output. Of those 90 students who participate in the program, the applicant predicts that 60% of the students will meet the definition of improved academic performance. This represents 67%, if you're keeping track, of the students who participate. But as I also mentioned before, the target should be written as numbers, not percentages. So 60 students as the outcome, 90 students for the output. The next step is to choose instruments to measure the output and outcome. Another of the significant changes that were made to the performance measure instructions last year in 2019 is that the instructions are less prescriptive about the types of instruments that can be used for particular measures. Folks who remember the discontinued measure ED5, you might remember that it required the use of a standardized pre-post test. But the new measure, ED5A, that's being used in this example, allows programs to choose the instrument that makes the most sense for your program design and for the target population. However, the selected instrument still needs to meet the criteria outlined in those instructions. You see those in the center of the slide. The instrument needs to be able to measure changes in academic performance at the individual beneficiary level. not on average overall, not in aggregate, but at the individual level. I also mentioned earlier that programs are responsible for selecting high-quality data collection instruments that produce valid, reliable, consistent, complete, and verifiable data. The 2020 Notice of Funding Opportunity lists out specifically required data quality standards that grantees have to meet. And in service to that goal, CNCS encourages programs to use pre-post assessments whenever possible. And we will also continue to work with grantees to make sure that data quality standards are being met during program implementation. The final step is for applicants to use the eGrants Performance Measures module to put together the outputs and outcomes they have chosen, the interventions they have selected, the MSYs and members they have allocated, and the instruments they have chosen to create an aligned performance measure. On this slide, you see a sample printout, PDF printout, of the applicant's completed performance measure for EDUCORP. Part of the outcome measure has been cropped here, but it would be below what you can see on this particular slide. And there's a link on the next slide to a tutorial on how to use the performance measures module. So let's go ahead and look at these additional resources. We have a lot of resources available to grantees and grant applicants to help you with performance measurement. The most important resource, the first one that you should look at, all grantees, all potential grantees should look at, is those performance measure instructions for each grant year. Remember that the performance measure instructions document also has those important appendices, MSY and member allocations in Appendix A, performance measures checklist in Appendix B, and then the FAQs in Appendix C. CNCS also has a comprehensive training resource on performance measures that we call our Performance Measurement Core Curriculum. There is a link to the core curriculum on this slide, and there are 5 courses in the curriculum. I've put in blue here on this slide the presentations that have the most direct relevance to performance measure design. And I mentioned earlier that there is a training on the mechanics of how to navigate the eGrants Performance Measure module. The first link on this slide is a link to that training. And then on the bottom of the slide, you can see a link to the AmeriCorps Performance Measures page on the Knowledge Network. That has links to prior year performance measure instructions, as well as a link to other training materials and resources related to performance measurement. And I should finally mention that AmeriCorps State and National has a special mailbox for grant applicants and current grantees as well, who have questions about funding opportunities or about the grant application process. And that includes the process of developing or revising performance measures. So if you think of a question after today's webinar, if you don't get a chance to ask it right now, or if you end up needing more clarification on anything that was said today, you can feel free to email AmeriCorps@cns.gov. But we do have a couple of other questions that have come in the Q&A box in the meantime. This is the time, by the way, we've come to the end of the formal part of the presentation. So this is the time to type in any questions that you have about performance measurements, about performance measure expectations for 2020 grant applications. I'll answer those now for the next several minutes. And again, AmeriCorps grants@cns.gov for questions after the webinar. Our first question, can you have 2 outcomes for the same performance measure? So what if EDUCORP tutors students in both reading and math and has separate pre-post assessments for each area? Both of those outcomes would fall under ED5A, so how would you recommend handling that? That's a great question. You can use the same national performance measure more than once for separate interventions. So if you have a tutoring intervention that's about literacy, and there are literacy-related outcomes, you can use ED1A and ED5A for the literacy intervention. If you have a separate intervention that's about math, you can use ED1A and ED5A again under a different performance measure for that math-related intervention. So that's one possibility. It's also possible that the same intervention has more than one outcome. So tutoring, for example, might have academic outcomes. It might also have academic engagement outcomes. Students might feel more attached to school, more motivated to continue their education. So you can have in the same performance measure, one output, which is the number of students served, and 2 outcomes that might be improved academic performance, ED5A, and then improved academic engagement, which is ED27C. So there are different ways that you can structure it, but you do have some flexibility. Really, again, performance measures should serve your intervention, should tell the story of your intervention, not the other way around. So thank you for that question. Question from Sarah, can you provide more detail on the reasons or scenarios when a post-only or retrospective tool would be most appropriate rather than a pre-post tool? That's a great question, Sarah. Honestly, I think what I would say is to reiterate that for the most part, CNCS's perspective is that pre-post is the best way to approach it. If you can do a pre-post assessment, that is by far the most preferable from our point of view, because that gives you the most objective assessment before and after of what change has occurred. So we have had folks, for various reasons, request to use post-only. We will certainly consider that in looking at your performance measure design, but CNCS's preference would be pre-post if at all possible. So thank you for that question. I, at the moment, don't see any other open questions, so I will pause for just a moment to see if there are any other questions that come in. Brittany Tonning, our training manager, is secretly in the room here as well, and so maybe I'll let her do a commercial on some upcoming trainings for the 2020 grant process. Brittany.
Thank you, Sarah, and for all of you that are on the line, I've been lurking in the background here, monitoring the Q&A. I did want to take this opportunity to let you all know that we have had a couple of webinars previous to this where the recordings are currently available on our NOFO page, so the page where you go to get all of your grant competition information. Recordings are up there for the State and National Grant Competition Overview webinar and the Best Practices in Budget Development webinar. Both of those, they have links. You can listen to our previous webinars. We do have a couple of upcoming ones as soon as tomorrow, which Sarah will be providing more knowledge to the field tomorrow from 2 to 3 o'clock Eastern time. And that's focused on writing an evaluation plan, so best practices in writing an evaluation plan. And then the following week, you get to hear from Sarah again.
I'm very sorry.
She's just full of knowledge. We want to make sure you guys hear from her. We'll have another one on November 13th from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. And that topic is focused on best practices in demonstrating evidence. So a couple of coming up. If you're not able to attend them, like I said, we do get the recordings up pretty quickly, so you can always go back and revisit them as you're in this application process.
All right, thank you, Brittany. And there are still no more questions that have come in, so I think we will go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. Best wishes, best of luck as you continue the grant application process. And remember, AmeriCorps grants at cns.gov if you have additional questions related to the grant application process. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.